Babylon is another symbolic name for the culture and life of the godless human society that has, in chapter 17, been represented by the great prostitute. So in chapter 18, we are shown why the fall of Babylon is inevitable and necessary. And in it, we hear the inhabitants of the earth lamenting its fall and the citizens of heaven celebrating its fall. So, rather than reading the text of the whole chapter out, I'm going to simply be referring to parts of it, and I'll leave you to have a look at the whole of the chapter 18 to check it out for yourself. But first of all, we have a proclamation. It's by another angel. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having a great authority, and the earth was made bright with his splendor. So this great angel, the same one, probably the angel Gabriel, as we've seen before, is the mighty angel with the little scroll of the gospel that we saw in chapter 10, the first verse of 10, and then the angel who announces the fall of Babylon in chapter 14, verse 8. So that's good news for the saints who've been oppressed by Babylon. And what he says in verse 2, he called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen, fallen is the great, Babylon the Great." So when he uses the perfect tense of prophecy here, which implies certainty in the future. So the whole system of the world is falling, going to where it belongs, which is the abyss, which is what Isaiah 13 calls the domain of demons. That is, it returns to the place from where it originated. And since we know what the abyss was, I've talked about it. Since the place is where the fire is constantly burning, its doom can also be described as being consumed by fire. But since all of these are only metaphors, its doom is spoken of as being cast into the depths of the sea in verse 21. So don't worry about the inconsistency of pictures here. So the justification for this is that it comes in verse 6. Render to her as she herself has rendered, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double draught for her in the cup she has mixed. So it means really only that she's made to pay in full for what she's done to others. Now God's concern is not with private vengeance, but with public justice. And the fact that this metaphor was also used of Judah in exile, I think in Isaiah 40, the second verse, and that there's a comforting messages given to them, assuring them of forgiveness, implies that there is forgiveness today for all who turn to trust in Christ, who drank that cup for us, the cup of God's wrath for us. Simply by experiencing in his own body the impact of the fury of the earth, actually. So anyway, note the implicit warning in verse 7, which we'll come to, but there are 5 reasons why Babylon has fallen. First of all, it is because of the emperor cult. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from her, the power of her luxury. Verse 3 of this chapter. So the idolatrous and blasphemous worship offered and encouraged by Rome, especially the emperor cult, is one of the reasons. This has headed John's list of charges throughout, especially, for example, in chapter 13. And this is what it means by describing Babylon as a harlot and charging her with fornication, that is idolatry, the worship of mammon or material things and the wealth, as well as the power that this gives people. And the second reason is because of her violence. And in you was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slaughtered on earth. That's the very last verse of this chapter, verse 24. So Christians who resisted the emperor cult were subject to violence or death, yet Babylon is condemned not only for the blood of the prophets and the saints, but for all who have been slain on earth. So we begin to see that John's announcement of judgment upon Rome or Babylon is more than the natural response of persecuted Christians against those who enforced emperor worship. Rule by violence itself is condemned. Ruthless use of violence by every empire is here included. Thirdly, we've got the hubris or the arrogance of the whole culture. I think the Greek words here, which I won't go into, rendered various forms of wantonness and luxury. In some translations, I think are better rendered by hubris or arrogance. So says John Sweet, I think it is, in one of his commentaries. So anyway, she glorified herself and lived luxuriously. So give her like measure of torment and grief, since in her heart she says, I rule as a queen, I am no widow, I will never see grief. That's verse 7. So she glorified herself rather than God, as sort of what I would call viewing herself as eternal Rome. She considers herself the absolute and eternal ruler of the world, as it were. And she says, a queen I sit, mourning I shall never see, or grief I shall never see. So her hubris is actually an affront and challenge to God as the only rightful sovereign. Fourthly, we've got the whole business of the worship of material wealth. Now, this is the lament that actually forms the sort of center part of this chapter from verses 19 to 21. And it picks up the thought of chapter 17, verse 2, the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. And it shows how the spiritual adultery which the kings of the earth have committed with a great harlot is none other than the worship of mammon, that is worldly wealth. And this is embedded in a word of judgment that expands on the proclamation of judgment which we find in 14 verse 8, which simply says, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has made all the nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. So I'm just going to read part of the text, but all the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels and pearls, fine linen, purple silk and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood and all kinds of articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, choice flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, slaves and human lives. Alas, alas, the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. So no one can fail to notice the massive use of economic and commercial language in this lament. The use of actual violence against Christians was actually still quite rare in John's time. Economic pressure was far more prevalent, and I think I noted that in chapter 13 at the end. They faced external economic pressures to participate in pagan culture and share its values, just as they faced internal pressures of longing for the dainties of the good life, of Roman prosperity, from which too strict commitment to the Christian faith might actually exclude them. So anyway, once again, however, Babylon is condemned for more than exerting economic pressure on Christians that might contribute to their loss of faith. Rome's economic policies of living in luxury at the expense of the poor is condemned as such, quite apart from its direct religious consequences. So the collapse of world commerce and economy comes with the suddenness of the worldwide black, like a worldwide Black Monday. If you recall to the Black Monday, I think it was in back in 2008, I can't remember. In 1 hour your judgment has come, it says in verse 10 and verse 17, i.e. it's in a sudden moment. So wealth creates a false sense of security, which actually is the root meaning of the word mammon. And this prevents people seeing greed, cruelty and injustice in its true light. Finally, we come to the seduction of the saints, which comes out in a phrase in verse 21. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. So verse 21 takes up the enacted parable of judgment against ancient Babylon in Jeremiah 51, verse 59, but it deepens its significance. So it's a great millstone rather than a millstone, and it's the sea instead of the river. So we need to link this to what Jesus said in Matthew 18, verse 6, when his disciples were preventing children from coming and receiving a blessing. And you remember he turns and says, if you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, and when we talk about little ones, it isn't just children, but it's the, if you like, childlike faith in Christ. It would be better for you, says Jesus, if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depths of the sea. And we see, therefore, that our opposition against Babylon is not just against its wealth and power, but against the threats and seductions by which it leads the little ones who believe in Jesus into sin. So the seduction of Babylon is actually more dangerous for the saints than its frontal attacks. So there's a danger of being assimilated into the Babylonian culture. The central section of verses 9 to 19 is in the form of a lament, which is actually very similar to what we find in Ezekiel's prophecy about Tyre, another of these cities that is described also as a harlot. So we find that in chapters 26 to 28 of the book of Ezekiel. And the lament is of it's by three groups of people. So first of all, we get the kings of the earth, which are basically the political leaders of the nations in modern parlance. And the kings of, it says, in the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. You can imagine how political leaders in certain nations would feel about the collapse of world commerce today, for example. So the second group affected are the merchants, the equivalent of modern day business directors, CEOs of companies, and it says in verse 11, the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. And then thirdly, the sea captains, which is all who run transport systems that carry world trade. And all the shipmasters and seafarers, sailors and all who trade on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. Babylon's burning, that is, in verse 17 and 18. So these are the chief beneficiaries of the systems and structures of world economy. This amazing culture of luxury and commerce has sucked nations into an idolatrous materialism. No wonder they lament the tragedy that's being played out before us in Revelation. Yet not everything about the great city was evil. And in verses 21 to 23, there's a genuine pathos in the lament, that the sound of music, skilled fashioners of civilization, the voice of the bride and the bridegroom are to vanish and be replaced by a dead and haunted city, which is how it's described in 18:2. So the sound of harpists and minstrels and flautists and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And an artisan of any trade will be found in you no more, and the sound of the millstone will be heard in you no more, and the light of a lamp will shine in you no more, and the voice of the bridegroom and the bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the magnates of the earth, and all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. John himself had some admiration for the great city, even in its perverted state. Find that in 17 verses 6 and 7. She had fallen, to be sure, but the poet walks among her ruins, feeling the weight of the loss and singing God's victory with a heavy heart. A quote from, I think it's somebody called Craddock, who wrote another of the commentaries on the book of Revelation. Now, all that is good and valuable actually will be redeemed and be present in the holy city, which we find when we get to chapter 21, particularly verses 24 and 26. So there's nothing wrong with craft, invention, science, and artistic beauty. But we must be aware of the moral blindness that comes from an attachment to things. Walter Brueggemann, another biblical theologian, comments, the imagination of a people stunted by the influences of an acquisitive, competitive, materialistic society. Such stunting blocks a culture's spiritual potential and creates a religionless public. Now, verses 22 to 23 are actually lifted from or adapted from Jeremiah 25, which goes on to speak of giving the land of Judah a Sabbath rest for 70 years. And what had happened, and the reason for that 70-year rest, is that for 490 years odd, they had not every 7 years allowed the land to rest and recover. A very wise, actually, provision. And relied on what the land naturally produced anyway. So that's the reason for it. And so this hints at a return to the primeval silence of chaos before God formed and filled the world in Genesis chapter 1, so that he can recreate and redeem nature. So this is so relevant for today. I mean, when we haven't given the land rest, we haven't treated the land properly, and it's as though the whole world, the whole of nature, needs a bit of a rest from man's aggressive exploitation of it. So followers of Christ find themselves addressed by two, but only two, commands in this chapter. First of all, come out of her, my people, verse 4. So just as Lot had to come out of Sodom in Genesis 14, Israel had to come out of Egypt in the Exodus story, and later out of Babylon, which we find recorded in books in Isaiah 48 and Jeremiah 50. So followers of Jesus had to come out of the world. And incidentally, as they had come out of Jerusalem at the time before the Jerusalem was destroyed. However, this is not a call for physical separation, but for moral separation. So the call to come out is not a matter of geographical relocation, but inner reorientation. Only then will we become effective as prophetic witnesses. I think that's another quote from Dennis Lennon. Secondly, there's the command to rejoice in verse 20. Followers of Christ are called to join in the rejoicing that's taking place in heaven, because the heavenly court has already reversed the judgment of this world's systems. The dirge of those who lament is balanced by the songs of those who celebrate Babylon's downfall, not out of mere vindictiveness, but because justice has been done. We find this expanded in the next chapter, and the way is now open for the successor to the harlot and Babylon, the one whose right to exist was won by the blood of the Lamb, to whom the woman of chapter 12 has been betrothed. And so we will get a betrothal or a wedding ceremony, actually, as the beginning of the next scene in chapter 19. So the courtroom language had a particular meaning for Christians condemned in the Roman courts of John's day. It can, of course, be good news to Christians of every age who see their own commitments rejected in the value system of the culture, but they are eventually vindicated in the decisions of the heavenly court, and that will only eventually become apparent. So that the Christians don't have to postpone its celebration until the New Jerusalem. Amid the injustice of this world and without resignation to it, believers in Christ join with the saints, apostles, and prophets of all the ages in celebrating its worship in the victory of God's justice already pronounced in the divine throne room. Remember Christ's vindication through the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, in the sure hope that it will be actually realized ultimately throughout all creation.